reading is from the book of Romans, chapter 8, verses 6 through 11. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law, nor can it do so. Those who are in the realm of the flesh cannot please God. You, however, are not in the realm of the flesh, but are in the realm of the Spirit. If indeed the Spirit of God lives in you, and if everyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, they do not belong to Christ. But if Christ is in you, then you through your body is subject to death because of sin. The Spirit gives you life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you.
I always get a kick out of reading from Romans right after we have a cute moment. You know, Paul is kind of like, thanks, Apostle Paul, what did you do that for? So I'm going to try to explain it to you the best I can this morning. I used to be an NPR news junkie. Anybody, any NPR news junkies out there? Kids absolutely detest it. It's awesome. But now I can't really handle listening to the news anymore. It's just you know, you understand. But every so often I turn on the car radio over to NPR just to see what's kind of going on. This past week I was pleasantly surprised by the break in political talk and news for an interesting story by the NPR show On Point. Any On Point listeners out there? Okay, it's really interesting. There was a show on Friday about Silicon Valley's obsession with immortality, and we'll get that slide up there. This is actually from Newsweek in 2015, but immortality is something that techies are obsessed with. Not immortality in terms of history or inventions or anything like the people of the past. We're not talking about the way Henry Ford is immortalized. We're talking, many of the technologists that lead Silicon Valley companies believe that they should live forever. Now there are a few different ways about thinking of living forever. One way is through the eradication of disease and the eradication of aging. And can you imagine just, you know, staying the same age, body-wise at least, forever? Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg and his wife recently committed $3 billion to just such a venture. Another way of thinking about immortality is through the technological enhancement of our bodies. We eventually mesh with our machines. We become cyborgs, and all that we are is uploaded into the cloud so that all the information that's stored on our brain can become digitized, and our personalities, everything that we are just becomes data, and you can upload yourself to one thing or another. No longer limited by a physical body. Wired Magazine recently posted a rebuttal on their blog about the prevailing attitude among high-tech companies with an article entitled, "Silicon Valley would rather cure death than make life worth living." Now, what do they mean by that? We face increasingly complicated and vexing problems in our world. But rather than focus on solving these problems, our best and brightest are just focused on selling us stuff. Have you noticed that? It's been interesting to me that throughout the Flint water crisis, most of these high-tech companies have been completely silent about how we can actually solve something that we took for granted for like 100 years. You know, it's amazingly a low-tech problem, but we can't seem to fix it. And I think that's amazing. The truth is that Amazon, Apple, Google, Tesla, these other companies, America's most innovative companies, are really, at their heart, consumer companies, consumer technology, phones, apps, advertising. They don't really care about you and I. I don't think that's news to you, but if you think they care about you, they don't. I'm always amused when you get a Facebook memory. Facebook always says, "We really care about your memories, and we thought you'd like to see this today." Do you ever notice that? It's like, oh, thank you, Facebook, for caring about me. They don't care about you.
The most thing I do is click it away.
They care about selling you stuff. That's what they care about. The efforts by some to cure disease, to extend lifespan, to upload your brain to the cloud, they sound noble, but they're not altruistic.
They're selfish in origin.
Yeah, it's not like Rockefeller giving his money away or Carnegie building libraries across the country. What concerns the people watching what's happening in Silicon Valley is that these efforts are self-serving. For them, this is like the next place to make money. If I could draw a distinction, what's happening there is very different from what's happening at a research hospital like Roswell Park or Sloan Kettering. They have very different goals in mind. It reminds me very much of what Paul is talking about in Romans 8:5, which is just one verse from previous to our reading. So take a look at that with me. Paul says, those who live according to the flesh have their mind set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their mind set on what the Spirit desires. See, as in Paul's day, we're focusing too much today on satisfying our own personal cravings. And as a result, we are mired in increasing inequality, in environmental degradation, social unrest, unemployment. The mission to take care of number one, that's me, right? Or you, taking care of you, has overridden all other concerns. It's the gospel according to Ayn Rand, for those of you who still read books out there. The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. Isn't that what makes our politics so maddening to follow today? We have lost the ability to tackle big challenges as a society because we are firmly locked into the mind of the flesh, as Paul says. We are self-centered, and our technology has actually made us more self-centered than we are. And I think this is one of the clearest examples to me that sin has real-world consequences. We don't always see it in people's actions, but we do see it in society, in the outcomes of people's lives. Paul's whole point in Romans is that life by the Spirit is truly life-giving, and life in the flesh is death-dealing. Take a look at Romans 8, verse 6. Paul writes, the mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. Now, Paul isn't trying to draw a wedge between the flesh, between the physical world and the spirit, and the spiritual world. What he's saying is that life in the Spirit is a way of conducting our lives in the physical world that's different from the prevailing culture around us. And this has always been true. The way of Christ has always been different than the culture around it. The world around Christians throughout history has always been hostile to the way of the Spirit because we naturally want to please ourselves. We even see how it's been hostile when the church has supposedly been in control of society. Because here's what happens. If we as Christians and we as the church seek anything other than Jesus, be it power, be it prestige, be it wealth, we turn inward to the life of the flesh. And we cannot follow the life of the Spirit. History bears that out repeatedly. It's not the misuse of religion, it's just religion that turns in on itself, back toward the life of the flesh, away from God. Because the life in the Spirit is a hard road to follow. It's only through the transformation that comes by turning our lives over to the way of Christ that allows us to live by the Spirit. Which is why Paul says in Romans, in verse 7, the mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. It cannot submit to God's law, nor can it do so. It doesn't want to. Those who are in the realm of the flesh cannot please God. And frankly, doesn't care. You, however, Paul says, are not in the realm of the flesh, but are in the realm of the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God lives in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, then they do not belong to Christ. Paul is urging us this morning, just as he did the original readers of Romans almost 2,000 years ago, to turn and pursue life in Christ above all. Because that's the only authentic path to life itself. All other ways, according to the Bible, lead to death. And we see those outcomes play out in our society. Life in the Spirit is not only the way of life, but it's also the way of hope. Why is life worth living? Why is it worth it to follow the path of life in the Spirit, even though it's a hard road to travel? Because it leads to life, and it leads to hope. It just doesn't lead us as individuals, but it leads the whole world to life and to hope. That's why our passage from Ezekiel is talking to us this morning. That's what it's telling us. What do we do with this amazing story of the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14? And it's quite a scene described here. The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley, and it was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, the bones that were very dry. It's an apocalyptic image. If you think about a valley of bones, we might think of the killing fields of Burma. We might think of a mass grave from the Holocaust. And I bring those very serious images to your attention because I want to make sure that we don't make light of this passage. God leads Ezekiel to a place of unspeakable horror and death, and most of all, despair. And in this vision, God asked the prophet a crazy question. These dry, disconnected bones that are scattered around this valley, can these bones live? What does Ezekiel say? I mean, what could he possibly say, right? He says, Sovereign Lord, only you know. It's the closest we get to a prophet in the Bible taking God's name in vain. It's as if he's saying, God only knows. You can imagine Ezekiel just kind of throwing up his hands. Why are you giving me this vision, God? And so God responds. First he tells Ezekiel to prophesy to the bones. I want you to talk to these bones. What a crazy thing. And so Ezekiel does. Why not? He's out there. Why not just talk to the bones? And they begin to come together. And they begin to form tendons and to put on flesh and then skin. But that's still not any better, right? Because what does Ezekiel see once these bones come together and put on tendons and flesh and skin? He sees a whole field of dead bodies. A field full of people who have been slain, probably through war. Israel's young men, its best and brightest. God's chosen people, killed in battle. A whole generation wiped out. And with that, the hopes of the people who were then carried off into exile in Babylon as the city of Jerusalem and the temple burned. So we have this field of dead bodies. What can God do with that? Well, God takes an additional step, doesn't he? He says in Ezekiel 37, 9 and 10, Then God said to me, Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, say to it, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast army. Flesh is not enough. These bodies need breath. They need spirit. Just as Paul says we need to live by the Spirit, these bodies require wind. They require breath. In Hebrew, the word for spirit and for wind and for breath is all the same. It's ruach. They need the Spirit of God to come alive. Without the Spirit, we are as lifeless as the valley of the slain. But with God breathing into us His Spirit, the message is that all things are possible. Then God says to Ezekiel, here's what your vision means. It's a message to the exiles who are out there in Babylon, not to give up hope on returning home. God means to send the people back and to restore them to the land. But like the vision of the valley of dry bones coming together and becoming people, this is something that only God can do. So watch out and see where God is at work. It's a message for us too, that even in the most difficult times, periods of decline, of which we are all too familiar, not to settle for that, not to get used to that. Far too many people today subscribe to a narrative of despair, and it's literally killing us. It's hurting us personally. It's hurting our health. It's hurting the church. It's hurting all of society's institutions. God is not a God of the status quo. God is king over the past, the present, and the future. And because of that, we have hope, real hope. In our communion liturgy, how do we celebrate that? Well, we tell of God's work in history in the people of Israel. We tell of God's work in the story of the life and death of Jesus. But the death of Jesus isn't the end of the story, is it? The resurrection is the end of the story. God isn't just in charge of the past and the present. The resurrection is a promise that God is in control of the future, that God has the last word for all time, even when things seem like they're out of control, even when we are very much in the midst of despair. And the resurrection of Jesus is also promised to each of us, his followers, that we will all feast together at the heavenly banquet. So like Ezekiel, God is calling us to prophesy to the dead bones, to look for the people, to look for the places that seem beyond hope, to speak words of hope to them, and see where we start to see bones, flesh, and breath, and life. Death is not the plan. Life is always the plan. As Paul says in Romans 8, verse 11, if the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will give life to your mortal bodies also, because of his Spirit who lives in you. Regardless of where we find ourselves, regardless of our situation, nothing is beyond hope. Our church is not beyond hope. Our city is not beyond hope. Our country is not beyond hope. Our world is not beyond hope. And so we are called to live according to the Spirit. And so we must act faithfully in the present in order to move into God's future. The past is over and gone. We as a community cannot afford to idolize it or enshrine it or despair at losing it. God has a plan for us in our own time and in our own place. Something that might look different from what was in the past. God's idea of eternal life is not like a few technological oligarchs who feel like they're indispensable enough to live forever, right? I mean, that's the worst part of all about this. Like, these guys just want to live forever. Like, you know, that you guys can go now and let somebody new take over. Maybe somebody else has got some good ideas. God's idea of immortality is not self-serving. God is not out to sell you a new app or a new phone. The way of the Spirit that leads all humanity to life and to hope and under the love and care of Christ. I ask you today to remember that all humanity is invited to live in life and hope under the care of Jesus Christ. Remember that in our celebration of communion. And remember that and practice that a week long, wherever you go.